Hello, you adapters. Now the work really begins. Uh, Now I know some of you got the shocking news that one, I didn't approve what you were choosing to adapt, or two, I informed you, which should have been no surprise, that you had to do whatever you were doing in a contemporary way. So, those of you who are struggling with that, you might want to contact me. I'm happy to do a phone call with you, whatever. Um, if I said I don't like what you're doing, I can't. It isn't actually the policy of the school that I have absolutely approval or non-approval. But when I give you a strong recommendation not to do something, the reason I'm doing that is because I've seen other students fall on that sword, and I'm trying to advise you. I want you to succeed. Everything I'm doing here with you is to make you succeed in this effort, and this is a difficult effort. And this is the time in the class when we're really going to start focusing primarily on the activity of writing the screenplay, and most of my lectures will be about that. And today's an actual sort of lecture that's significant bigger than anything I've done before. The other day, I had somebody else who was basically taking this class, and I did a one-on-one session with them at exactly this point. They had picked a project, a period piece to adapt, and they were uh, figuring out how to get it going, what to do. And many of you have an idea of what you're going to do, and that's good, although I would ask you to currently hold it lightly. I'm going to talk through a process here, which is a step process by which you can begin to do this adaptation and do it in a consistent way. Now, first, you've got to figure out a way to get your story into contemporary times. What is its milieu? Now, let me be clear about this. You could set this story in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the aughts, or the teens, and that's fine. Older than the 60s, no. Secondly, you don't need to set it in the United States. A lot of times I tell people that if you're going to do say you're a foreign student, you're Chinese, or you're Indonesian, or you're Mexican, or you're Russian, um, it's very important for you to try to set a story in a milieu that you know, that you have some familiarity with. So many people come and try to write a story about rich people in England, right? And I say, do you know any rich people in England? Are you an expert on that milieu? Or they try to write about rich people in Los Angeles. And I say, are you an expert on that milieu? And generally, no. They know nothing about it. So that means the attempt they make lacks any credibility. It's sort of like everything is sort of a Hollywood idea of what they think it's like, as opposed to what it's actually like. So you should know your milieu. Now, another possibility is you're going to set something. You can also set something in the future if you want. You can do a science fiction version of the story. That's perfectly acceptable also. But you also then must really understand that milieu. You must spend time world building. And if you want to talk about that, there's very few who are doing that. But if you want to talk about that, I'm happy to. The key point is the rules of your world, whatever they are, have to be set up fairly quickly in the first act. You've got about 10 minutes or about 10 to 15 pages to ground the audience in the world, in the contemporary world, whatever that is, and say, this is where we're at. Okay? So that's a first step. How am I going to do this? What is the milieu it's in? If there are rules like it's Peter Pan or it's some other fantastic thing, how is magic going to work in this world? What am I going to use? How's that all going to be? That's really a key step. So you do that. You figure that out. I'm not saying that's easy. It's often difficult, but you figure that out. Then you want to go to your characters. We build story out of characters. So, and this is, you have had me the discussion of the 3 dimensions of characters. And there's a handout which is part of this assignment. The assignment for this is to work on your 3 dimensions of your protagonist character. This lecture I'm about to give is really trying to provide some clarity on what we mean by these 3 dimensions. There are 3 dimensions, and then the point of this is, how does one create a character? We're going to give you a tool by which you create characters. The first dimension is want and drive. The second dimension is characteristics and backstory. And the third dimension is flaw and need. Everything I'm about to say to you is covered in the handout, but hopefully this will help. The want is easily the most important thing you got to figure out for each of your characters. What do they want? And the key is, and this is for some reason confusing, so listen carefully, what do they want in the film? In the course of the film, they're going to have a goal of some kind. And by the end of the film, they will either fulfill that goal or they will not. They will get what they want or they will not get it. The audience has to understand what that want is. Now, it's a little bit complicated because the want might evolve during the course of a film. But generally, you're going to have a very clear idea, and it should be pragmatic. At least, if it evolves, every one of those wants is pragmatic. It's a thing. It's a measurable item that they can get to. They're going to get revenge on this character. They are going to reach the promised land. They are going to get back to Earth somehow. They are going to defeat the villain. They are going to find a man to love. They are going to break up with their girlfriend. It is a clear, dramatic end. It is not obscure. It is crystal clear. When it happens, right? It's not obscure. Drive, which is part of the first dimension, is what is the psychological underpinnings to that want. So if somebody wants to, shall we say, rob a bank, right, to get $1 million so they can retire. Actually, let me put it this way. A criminal, a common want in a lot of movies is, a criminal says, I've been very successful for a long period of time, and I want out, right? So they want to stop doing crime. But there's always one more thing they've got to do, right? So their desire to retire is their want. And to some degree, their drive then gets to be a desire for peace, a desire for serenity, a desire for not being in the game anymore. That's their drive, okay? So you've got to have this very clearly outlined. You have to know what this is. And you, in this exercise, I want to see my protagonist's want is X. My protagonist's drive is Y. And these aren't long, the X is not a long phrase. It's pretty short. The drive's a little more psychological. It can be a little bit deeper. But it isn't elaborate. And it isn't, well, it can be said, the want generally is somewhat story-driven. What do they want in the story? I hope that helps. Backstory and characteristics are fairly straightforward. They are characteristics as all the elements of how the person looks. So in other words, what clothes do they wear? How do they wear their hair? My characteristics are, I've got glasses, I've got gray hair. If you listen carefully, you can probably hear that I have a Massachusetts accent to some degree. I drive my car to the Harvard Yard. I have brown eyes. I'm, an older man. This kind of thing. My backstory right? So second dimension is characteristics, and instantly characteristics include accent, how I walk, um, everything you can think of. Backstory is how I got to be here. In other words, characters have a history before they come to the movie. So the backstory is what gets them there, right? So you need to know your character's backstory. Now, part of the handout is there's 100 questions there. I'll discuss how you want to manage it, but many of those questions have to do with backstory. Who are your character's parents? What did they do for a living? When did your character lose their virginity? How did they feel about it? Have they ever been in love? If so, who? Are they married? Do they have children? You need to know all this stuff. Were they ever abused? Have they ever had a traumatic incident? All of this stuff is crucial. Now, you can change this stuff as you write your story, as you get into it, because I'll explain why characters are important, but this isn't written in stone. You're going to take a shot at this, and you're going to write characters and backstory. But in fact, you'll probably change them as you go along. Then you get to flaw and need. Now, this is the most difficult thing for me to get across, and I'm going to give it a shot. It's very important. Flaw is a character flaw that your character has. A flaw. Everybody has flaws. Everybody. Sometimes we know them. Sometimes we don't. I know, for instance, that I am prone to grandiosity. I am also arrogant. These are a couple of my flaws. Now, I have flaws I don't know about, right? So I can't tell you what they are. You as a writer need to know what your flaws are. Now notice what I said when I described my flaws. They're very short. They're character defects. Arrogance, flaw, greed. They aren't story driven. They aren't long-winded. They are short, pithy statements that are about character flaw. I don't want to see a flaw that goes like, is too obsessed with catching the antagonist. That's not a flaw. That's not a character flaw. Obsessive might be. That's interesting. I'm not sure it's deep enough, but it's interesting. So you want to really describe these in terms of character flaws. What is somebody's character flaw? The need is the mirror image of the character flaw. If their need was fulfilled, their character flaw would no longer exist. The classic example of this is a greedy person's character flaw is not more the mirror image, the need that a greedy person has is not more money. It's to be satisfied with what they have. So the character flaw of greed is satisfied by the need of being satisfied with what you have. Again, similarly, the character flaw of arrogance, the mirror image is humility. You must get this. You must know this for your characters. And it's got to be as succinct and simple as I just said it, right? It's not elaborate. It's not story-driven. And the reason for this, and this is something for you to think about, is that the end of Act 2, in plot point 2, they are going to have to, as a character, the protagonist, as a character, will have to fulfill their need to face down the antagonist. That's their arc. That's what gives a character depth. So the handout is 104 questions, and it breaks it down to some degree in terms of want, drive, backstory, characteristics, and then flaw and need. In fact, I don't think you need to answer all 104 questions to pull this off, but I want you to look at all the questions for every character. And this assignment this week has to do with the protagonist. So you definitely need to go into some depth of the protagonist. Um, Try to be consistent. Try to answer the questions that are important. Um, if you know, for instance, that your character is as an example, is going to be a hard driving police detective, right? They have to have some backstory that implies why they have these skills, what it is that's doing it, what it is. If somebody's 30 years old and they are a detective in the New York Police Department, right? Well, that's not easy to do, for one thing. It's hard to get promoted to being a detective. That means you're pretty hard driven, right? What is your backstory, and perhaps what is your flaw and need that causes you to do that? You would have, for instance, as a drive, you might have a screaming desire to right injustices, right? That might be your drive. Your want often is to solve the murder case you're on right now. You're determined to do it. But your drive underneath that is to solve injustices. What your flaw and need are, it can change. It can be different. It can be different things in the sense that you can have a different flaw and need for a character, but you should understand what they are. And a character like that, incidentally, when you get into their backstory, they might have been in the military police in military. They might have a father or a mother who was a cop. They might have a father who was a criminal, and they determined that they would never be like that father. So you need to think through how it's going to work, because to some degree, if you want a driven person, and they're going to be driven during the course of the movie, you must then create a backstory that matches that drive. Okay? So when you do these assignments on a protagonist, for instance, I want you to take the handout. I want you to really work on want and drive, flaw and need, and then the characteristic and backstory, the second dimensions, you can do by perusing through and seeing what questions are useful to you. But be pretty thorough. These documents should be, I don't want to see the questions all answered. That's impossible for me to really analyze. But I want to see a consistent 2 to 3 pages on these characters. And you're going to get a lot of comments from me on want, drive, flaw, and need. This is really the heart of the matter. So that's your assignment. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this, and if you want to go a little further, is once you've determined what your character's want is going to be, right? Then the antagonist's want is to stop or prevent the protagonist from getting what they want. And that's going to begin to describe the conflict of your movie. And people struggle with the conflict. So that's another key idea. So that's where the conflict is. So when you create a want, make it drive your story, right? Yesterday somebody said to me, well, his want is to find out who he is. I said, but why is that helping your story? It's not at the core of your story. In this case, they were talking about a love story. I said, they've got to want the person they desire. That's their want, right? Not to find out who they are. That doesn't drive the story anywhere. But if it's this person desires this other person, and that's their want, I want to win the hand of this person, then that drives a story. That begins to get it at the core of the story. So you need to, whatever their want is, has to be driving your story. One of the reasons we have you just do the last exercise is to determine what that protagonist in the original PD, what they wanted, right? What they want. So once you come up with these wants for your protagonist and your antagonist, that defines your conflict. And that's where the story begins to spin out. But you've got to have this stuff clearly. And this takes a lot of time. There's no way around. This is where push comes to shove. 10 to 12 hours a week. That's what it takes to do this class. If you do a pretty good job on the protagonist, feel free to move on to the antagonist and do the same analysis on them, right? So I'll leave you with that. I know that's a long-winded thing, but this is a core. This is where we get going. All right, thank you.